All right, welcome to the ninth block, the Civil War, the blue and the gray. And this is your first set of notes entitled Fort Sumter. By late 1860, after the election of Lincoln in early November, the Confederate states, the states that had seceded, had occupied without firing a shot all the federal forts and garrisons and arsenals and bases and ports that were located in the South. They pretty much were taken over by the men who controlled them, and there were no conflicts, physical violent conflicts about it. And by the spring of 1861, there was only 2 federal installations in the South still under control from Washington, D.C., the capital. One of them was Fort Pickens in Florida, and the other was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. In December of 1860, South Carolina had sent commissioners to Washington asking the government of President Buchanan to hand the fort over. Buchanan refused. Buchanan decided that he was going to resupply the fort in December, and he sent an unarmed ship to Star of the West to bring food and supplies to Fort Sumter. Warning shots were fired by South Carolinian forces, and it forced the ship back. Those truly, technically, were the first shots fired during the Civil War, but since they didn't hit anything and nobody got hurt, they're kind of forgotten to history. Compromise efforts like that of Senator Crittenden take place after these first warning shots that turned back American forces were done. President Lincoln becomes president on the 4th of March, 1861. And in his inaugural address, he states calmly but firmly his beliefs on the legality of secession and the nature of the Constitution and the nature of the compromise and the nature of the government that he had been elected legally, constitutionally, to lead. And he first says that secession is illegal. And secession is illegal, Lincoln says, because the Union is older than the Constitution. The states had come together before the Constitution had been written, and therefore the Constitution could not be used for the states to to become not unified. That states could not secede because they're under the Constitution, because their union was older than the Constitution itself. That the Articles of Confederation and under the Second Continental Congress, the states had unified into one country, and just because states happened to live under the Constitution did not mean that they could leave it, because the Union was older than the Constitution. Lincoln also goes on to argue that the Union is a union of the people, not of the states, and secession is illegal. And after he kind of freaked out the South by saying, no, secession is clearly illegal, he sought to placate the South. And he said that he did not seek to destroy slavery where slavery already existed. That he was perfect. He did not like slavery. He thought slavery was a moral evil. But he did not see that he had the constitutional authority to abolish it in states where it already existed. So he promised the South that he had no plans to end slavery or to abolish slavery or to destroy slavery where it already existed. He continued by saying that secession was insurrectionary and revolutionary, and then he finished up his speech with a firm declaration that it would be the policy of the Lincoln administration to hold, occupy, and possess all federal property in the South. And obviously, since there was only 2 federal properties that was going on, everyone knew that Lincoln meant that he meant to hold, to occupy, and to possess Fort Sumter. But Fort Sumter, commanded by a man by the name of Major Anderson, is rapidly running out of supplies. So Lincoln, in his first days in office, is faced with an incredible decision that he has to make. If Lincoln chooses not to reinforce the fort, then Major Anderson must, by definition, he's going to run out of food, and he's going to have to surrender. And if Lincoln does not reinforce the fort, no one will ever believe that he intended to fight for the Union in the first place. If he's going to give up with this first potential battle, there's no way that anyone's going to believe that he means to save the Union. However, over Lincoln's head is the threat from the other slave states that did not secede, that if he used force, they would secede. So So if Lincoln does not fire on the fort, the Confederacy might just be those 6 little states down the very south in a row, and that North Carolina and Virginia and Arkansas and Tennessee would all stay in the Union. But if Lincoln does not, if Lincoln does reinforce the fort, all right, so if Lincoln does not, the southern states that secede, there will be fewer in number, but they're going to be seceding, and there's going to be 2 separate countries. But if Lincoln does reinforce the fort, it's going to mean civil war. That he's going to fire, and the South is going to fire in response, and then once you roll the dice of war, you never know where they're going to lead. Other southern states will secede, and Lincoln might save the Union, but in doing so, it's going to be through the use and the threat of force and violence. Lincoln deliberates on the question with his cabinet, with his advisors, and by himself late at night in the White House for well over a week. And after careful deliberation, Lincoln decided to try to thread the needle. He decided to try to resupply, but not reinforce the fort. That he would send food and water, but no ammunition, no guns, no cannon, and no more troops. He told the leaders of South Carolina that the resupply ships were on their way, and he would not be sending more troops, and he would not be sending more weapons unless the South fired first. And in that case, President Lincoln said he was going to do what he could to hold, possess, and occupy the fort. So Lincoln's kind of returned the serve, if you want to use a sports metaphor. And now the South Carolinian leaders and the Southern leaders have a dilemma of their own. If they let the ships through, they look weak. But if they don't let the ships through and they fire, they are inaugurating civil war, and, morally speaking, they'll have fired first, which you always want to look like the defender and not the aggressor when it comes to these sorts of things. The Confederate government at the time was in Montgomery, Alabama. They debated the issue for hours and hours and hours also, and finally decided that to look weak was worse than to look belligerent. They ordered P.G.T. Beauregard, the commander on the scene at Fort Sumter, to demand the surrender of the fort. If the fort did not surrender, General Beauregard was to open fire and force its surrender. On the 12th of April, 1861, General Beauregard communicated with Major Anderson, demanding the surrender of the fort. Major Anderson made it clear that he would not surrender the fort. And upon receipt of that message from Major Anderson, General Beauregard took careful aim at this United States fort in Charleston Harbor, and he opened fire. The Civil War had begun. Both sides were now actively trying to kill the other. 2 days later, with supplies running out and no hope of being reinforced, Major Anderson, having done all that honor and duty dictated and demanded that he do, Major Anderson took down the United States flag and raised the white flag of surrender, and surrendered the fort. His men marched out and were taken into captivity. Immediate consequences were clear on both sides of the country. In the North, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to the colors to repress the rebellion. In the South, 4 more states seceded, claiming that Lincoln had no right to force the states back into the Union. Once Major Anderson had refused to surrender and fired on the South, and President Lincoln made it clear that he was going to use force to keep the Union together, those 4 other states seceded. They were Virginia. Now, a part of Virginia, in the northwest part of the state, disagreed with Virginia's decision to secede, and those counties seceded from Virginia. And those counties in the northwest part of the state will form the state of West Virginia and will join the Union in 1863 as the 35th state. So Virginia's out, although not all of Virginia is out. Arkansas is out, Tennessee is out, and North Carolina is out. 4 other slave states decide to stay with the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware down at letter D. Maryland has an interesting case. Maryland was kind of split 50-50 between Union and Confederate sympathies, between Northern and Southern sympathies. And in order to keep that state a part of the Union, President Lincoln took some pretty harsh measures, including canceling, in the state of Maryland, the right of habeas corpus. He arrests many and puts lots of people in jail without a trial. Anyone who was suspected to have Confederate sympathies was put into jail and kind of left there to rot. President Lincoln claimed that his powers as Commander-in-Chief of the Army during a time of war gave him those powers. It was a power he needed to suppress insurrection and rebellion. And President Lincoln kind of took the Constitution. If he didn't cross over its lines, he took them right to the limit. He said that secessionists had no rights under the United States Constitution, that they were intent on committing treason, and Lincoln was not going to allow them to do that. Also, from a military point of view, if Maryland and Kentucky became Confederate states, then the Union military job would just be that much harder. So 4 slave states stayed with the Union. And Lincoln famously said that, I'm trying to remember the quote now, exactly. It has something to do with, he would accept the help of God, but he needed the help of Kentucky. That's not the exact quote, but that's the gist of it, that he needed Kentucky in the Union, or else the war would be that much more difficult. So was the war started, and historians have been asking, for a long time, was the war inevitable? And it's fun to play with counterfactuals, and you can say, what if there had been no more new territory? What if there was no Kansas-Nebraska Act? What if Lincoln had not been elected? What if Dred Scott had been ruled differently? What if Lincoln had let the South go in peace, etc., etc.? And these are fun and interesting questions for, amateur historians to ask. But the real question is, how did the people at that time see it? Did they see the war as inevitable, or did they see the war as an accident? And those are questions that are open to interpretation. Paul Johnson believes, and he said, in his book, that, it was only the people of South Carolina and Massachusetts that wanted war. Only the extremists in the North and only the extremists in the South really wanted this conflict. But what I think we can say is that by 1860, the people of the North and the people of the South saw themselves as 2 separate nations and 2 separate people living with completely different cultures and completely different ways of life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, speaking for the North, kind of summed it up when he said, "I do not see how a barbarous community and a civilized community can constitute one country." A Southern slave owner, speaking for much of the South, said, "These Northern people hate us, annoy us, and would have us assassinated by our slaves if they dared. They are a different people from us, whether better or worse, and there is no love between us. Why then continue together?" Judging by the lack of votes for the Compromise Constitutional Union Party in 1860, it seemed more people wanted their section to prevail than wanted the Union to stay together. And if you don't want to look at it from a cynical point of view, people were voting for what they believed in, rather than what they thought was easy or peaceful. And so, this fundamental difference, as evidenced from the very earliest aspects of colonialization, Massachusetts, Virginia, this divergence of American culture that was hundreds of years old, even by 1860, was now going to resolve itself in a civil war of, to our brains in 2012, a civil war of unimaginable magnitude. So let's see what happened.